I never planned on getting lost. No one does. But looking back, I can see exactly where I messed up. It started as a simple hunting trip. Just me, my rifle, and the quiet of the mountains. I had done it a dozen times before. The drive up was routine. I parked my truck at the base of an old, half-forgotten logging road and hiked in. The sun was low in the sky by the time I reached my usual camping spot, a little clearing near a slow-moving creek. The woods felt alive, but not in a bad way. Just the usual sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the distant trickle of water. I set up camp fast, got a small fire going, and ate a quick meal. Nothing fancy, just some jerky, a granola bar, and a couple swigs from my water bottle. After that, I crawled into my sleeping bag and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I should have stayed close to camp, but I got cocky. I wanted to push deeper into the woods, farther than I'd gone before. Maybe I'd find a good spot where no one else had been. I hiked for hours, picking my way through the underbrush, scanning the trees for any signs of deer. I saw plenty. Tracks in the soft earth, fresh droppings, even a few broken branches where something big had passed. I was sure I'd find one soon, but I didn't. The tracks led me deeper and deeper until I realized something. I had no clue where I was. That was my first real mistake. My second mistake was assuming I could find my way back easily. I wasn't panicking, not yet. I just turned around and started walking. Except the forest didn't look the same. I told myself it was fine. I had my GPS. I pulled it out, turned it on, and nothing. The screen was frozen, stuck on a map that wouldn't update. My phone? No signal. Compass? I had one, but even that felt useless. Every direction looked the same: thick trees, endless shadows, and no sign of my trail. I kept moving. The hours passed, and the light started to fade. My stomach gnawed at me, reminding me I hadn't eaten since morning. But food wasn't my main concern anymore. Finding shelter was. I stumbled across a dry creek bed, its banks steep and lined with tangled roots. It was as good a place as any to rest. I dropped my pack, sat down, and tried to think. I had enough supplies for another day, maybe two if I stretched it. But I needed to find a way out. Fast. Night came fast, swallowing the forest in blackness. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me awake. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. My rifle was next to me, loaded. I gripped it tight, telling myself it was just nerves. Morning came slow. I forced myself to eat, then started walking again. The trees seemed thicker, the ground rougher. My legs ached. My throat was dry. The little bit of water I had left wouldn't last long. And then I smelled it. Rot. Something dead, nearby. I followed the scent, my heart hammering. Maybe it was a deer carcass, something fresh. Maybe I could use it to figure out what predators were nearby. I wish I hadn't looked. The body, if you could call it that, was torn open, its ribs cracked wide like a broken cage. The flesh was dark, almost black, the stomach hollowed out. I had seen kills before, but this was different. This thing had been eaten. But not all at once. I wasn't alone out here. The thought hit me hard. I wasn't the only thing hunting in these woods. I backed away, moving fast. My rifle was up, safety off, finger near the trigger. My senses were sharp now, every sound too loud, every shadow too deep. I needed to get out. Now, but the forest wasn't done with me. I walked until my legs screamed, until my feet bled. The sun was starting to dip again when I heard it. Movement. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something bigger. I stopped, heart pounding. Listened. Silence. Then another step. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. I started moving again, faster now, almost running. My breath came hard. My throat dry as dust. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, rifle up. Nothing. Then another sound. Closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. The forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my arms, my pack bouncing against my back. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move. and then air. I stumbled forward, falling onto open ground. Clearing, a real one, and on the other side, my truck. I almost laughed. I had been so close this whole time. I sprinted the last few steps, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back once, just for a second, and in the trees just beyond the clearing, something moved. Something that had followed me, something that had almost caught me. I didn't look again. I just drove. I never went back. I never used to believe in stories. I figured every so-called cryptid sighting was just a trick of the mind. Some guy in the woods too long, hearing things, seeing shapes in the dark. I wasn't a skeptic exactly. I just didn't think about it at all. But after what happened to me, I think about it all the time. It started as a hunting trip. Just me, my rifle, and a weekend in the woods. I had been going to this area since I was a kid. My dad used to take me out here, deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, miles away from anyone. The land was thick with old-growth trees, stretching on forever in every direction. No cell service, no towns nearby, just endless wilderness. I liked it that way. I got to my usual camping spot in the late afternoon, set up my tent, and gathered some firewood. The sun was already dipping low by the time I sat down to eat. It was quiet, peaceful, but I felt something. It was small at first, just an awareness, like when you think someone's watching you. The kind of feeling you shake off without realizing it. I went to bed early, planning to start my hunt before dawn. The night was cold but calm, and I dozed off quickly. Then something woke me, a sound low and distant, not an animal noise, not the wind. I listened. Silence. I told myself I had imagined it and tried to go back to sleep. Then there it was again, closer. It sounded like a growl, but not quite. Deeper, rougher, almost human. I sat up, heart pounding. My rifle was right next to me, my flashlight too. I grabbed it, turned it on, and aimed it at the thin fabric of my tent. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the soft rustling of leaves. I waited, barely breathing. If it was a bear, I needed to be careful. If it was a wolf, even more so. But I didn't hear anything else. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and laid back down. I should have left right then. The next morning, everything felt normal again. Birds were singing. The sun was shining. I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy. I packed a small bag, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started hiking. I planned to go deeper into the woods than usual, looking for deer trails. I hiked for hours, moving slowly, scanning the trees. I saw fresh tracks, followed them, but never caught sight of anything. Then I noticed something odd. The woods were wrong. Too quiet. No birds. No insects. No wind in the trees. Just dead silence. That's when I found the deer. It was fresh, maybe killed an hour ago. But something was off. Its throat was torn open, deep claw marks raking across its body. But no blood, like something had drained it. I knelt down, studying the wounds. They were too big for a wolf, too deep for a bear. The cuts were rough, jagged, as if whatever did it had long claws but didn't quite know how to use them. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I stood up, gripping my rifle, scanning the trees. I felt that same awareness again. Something was watching me. I turned slowly, looking in every direction. Nothing, but the silence pressed in. The air felt heavy. The woods felt wrong. I took a slow step back, then another. That's when I heard it. A snap, not far behind me. I spun, rifle up, heart slamming in my chest. Still nothing, just trees, shadows, the same emptiness. But I knew something was there. I started moving, walking fast, trying not to run. Running triggers predators, makes them chase. I kept my gun up, scanning every inch of the forest. Then I saw it, barely, a shape half hidden behind a tree. Tall, too tall, and the eyes, glowing amber in the dim light. I froze. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was standing, on two legs. The breath caught in my throat. My finger twitched on the trigger. Then it moved, fast, a blur of dark fur and muscle, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait. I turned and walked fast, almost jogging, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was following me. The feeling of being watched never left. The sky was getting darker. I had spent too much time tracking, too much time staring at that damn deer carcass. I had to get back to camp. I walked faster. The trees blurred past. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it, breathing, right behind me, deep, wet, too close. I spun, rifle up. Nothing, just trees. But I knew it was there, waiting, watching. It was playing with me. I turned and ran. Screw the rules. Screw what predators do. I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my arms. I could hear it moving behind me. Heavy footsteps, fast, keeping up easily. My camp. I just needed to reach my camp. Then my tent. I crashed into the clearing, skidding to a stop, breath ragged. I spun, aiming into the trees. Silence. Nothing moved. I stood there, shaking, rifle clutched in my hands, waiting for something to lunge at me. But the woods were still, like it had never been there. I grabbed my pack, shoved everything inside as fast as I could. Then, I heard the last sound I would ever hear in those woods. A low, guttural laugh. Not a coyote, not a person, something in between. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to breathe. I jumped in my truck, started the engine, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse. A shape just beyond the tree line. Tall, lean, covered in dark fur, watching me leave, smiling. I never went back. I've always been comfortable in the woods, grew up around them, hunted with my dad, camped with friends, hiked more trails than I could count. I know how to track, how to handle a rifle, how to build a fire. I'm not the kind of person who scares easy, but I'll never forget what happened that weekend. And I haven't stepped foot in the woods since. It was early October, cool mornings, warm afternoons. The trees were starting to turn, patches of orange and red stretching out for miles. I had taken a couple days off work to spend some time outdoors. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I liked it better that way. Just me, my gear, and nothing but the woods around me. I drove out to a spot I'd been to before, miles off the main road. No cell service, no people, just the way I liked it. I parked my truck near the trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking. I wasn't going far, just a few miles in where a small river cut through the woods. Good spot for fishing, good spot for being alone. The hike was quiet, peaceful. I set up camp by late afternoon, pitched my tent near the water, gathered firewood, and sat down to eat. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when I noticed it. Something was off. It wasn't obvious at first, just a feeling, like the woods were holding their breath. The usual sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, had gone quiet. Not completely, but enough that I noticed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator nearby, a coyote, a bobcat. It happens. But the feeling didn't go away. After dinner, I sat by the fire, watching the flames crackle and pop. The shadows stretched out longer as the night settled in. I was getting tired, but something kept me from crawling into the tent. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a coyote. I caught it at the edge of the firelight, just past the tree line. Low to the ground, thin. It was sitting back on its haunches, almost like it was watching me. Its fur was dark, almost black, but patchy in places with spots of pale skin showing through. Mangy, starving, maybe. I felt a twinge of sympathy. It didn't look aggressive, just wrong. I stood up slowly, shining my flashlight toward it. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing white. It didn't move. I clapped my hands, trying to scare it off. Nothing. I yelled. Still nothing. That's when I realized something was off. It wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was too still, too calm. It just sat there, staring at me. I grabbed my rifle and aimed it low, not wanting to hurt it, just scare it off. I fired a shot into the ground. The crack echoed through the woods. It didn't even flinch. My heart started pounding. I wasn't scared, not yet, just uneasy. I wasn't used to animals acting like that. I backed up toward the tent, keeping the light on it. After a minute, it finally stood up. And that's when I realized something was seriously wrong. It wasn't standing on 4 legs. It was on 2. The way it moved, it wasn't natural. His back legs were bent wrong, joints too high, steps too slow. Took one awkward, jerky step forward, and then another. I felt my chest tighten. My hands were sweating. I kept the rifle pointed at it, heart hammering. Took a few more slow steps toward me. Its mouth opened slightly, but there was no sound, just dark gums and long, yellow teeth. I fired another shot, this time at the ground closer to it. Nothing. Kept walking. I grabbed my pack and threw it over my shoulder without taking my eyes off the thing. I wasn't staying out there with whatever this was. I didn't care about my tent, my gear. I could replace it. I started backing away toward the trail. Rifle up, flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when it dropped to all 4s. The movement was fast, sudden, almost insect-like. Its limbs folded underneath it at strange angles. The skin on its back stretched too tight over its ribs, and it started running. Not toward me, around me, circling. I could barely keep the light on it. It moved too fast, darting between trees. Every time I caught a glimpse, it was closer. I ran. I didn't think about anything but getting back to my truck. The trail was rough, roots and rocks catching my boots. I nearly fell a dozen times. My breath came hard, chest burning, and I could still hear it. Behind me, pacing me, breathing. It wasn't panting like a dog. It was deeper, rougher, wet. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second. It was there, not even 20 feet behind me, running on all 4s, but wrong. The spine arched too high. Its head hung low, swinging side to side as it moved, and its eyes still glowing white. I ran harder. The trail felt endless. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were going to burst. Then I saw the trailhead. My truck was right there. I sprinted, throwing myself toward the driver's side door. I yanked it open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. For a second, I just sat there, gasping for air. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the trees, on 2 legs again. It didn't move, didn't blink. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I threw it in reverse, tires kicking up gravel. As I backed out, I kept my eyes on it. And it smiled. Not like a dog. Not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was a human smile, white, full of teeth. I drove all the way home without stopping. When I finally parked in my driveway, I sat there for a long time, engine off, windows up, just listening to my own breathing. I don't know what I saw out there, but I know it wasn't a dog, and I know I'll never go back. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I'm not the type who hikes for the Instagram pictures or brags about how far off the grid I can get. I just like the quiet. I like the woods, the way it feels to walk until you forget about the rest of the world. No cars, no people, just trees and silence. I've been hiking alone for years. I know what I'm doing. I always pack smart, let someone know where I'm going, and stick to the trails mostly. But that weekend, I made a mistake. A small one at first. The kind of mistake you shrug off until it's too late to fix. I had a few days off work and wanted to spend them in the Adirondacks. There's a trail up there I've done before, about 20 miles looped through thick forest, ridgelines, and a few remote lakes. It's rugged but manageable. I've done it twice before, both times solo. The first day was perfect. I started hiking early, and by late afternoon I had made it to the first campsite by one of the smaller lakes. The water was calm, the air was cool, and the woods were alive with the usual sounds. Birds in the trees, wind through the branches, the gentle lap of water on the shore. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. But I kept waking up. Not to noises, it was something else. A feeling. I know how that sounds, but it's the best way I can describe it. Like something wasn't right. Like someone was standing just outside my tent, watching. Every time I shined my flashlight out there was nothing, just trees. My fire had burned down to embers. I sat there for a while, listening. Nothing but the wind. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. It happens. The woods can get to you if you let them. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning felt normal again. The sun came up, the woods felt alive. I packed up camp and kept moving. About 3 miles in, I found a deer carcass just off the trail. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. It was picked clean, bones scattered, ribs exposed, but the weird thing was how it looked. I've seen plenty of dead animals in the woods. This was different. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks, no blood nearby. It was like something had dropped it there. It gave me that feeling again, like I was being watched. I kept walking. By mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen another person all day. That's not uncommon on these trails, especially this time of year, but it was starting to feel off. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I decided to push farther than I'd planned. I wanted to get to the next campsite before dark. Something about this place was crawling under my skin, and I didn't want to hang around. The trail started to climb, winding up into the hills. The trees got thicker, the shadows deeper. By the time the sun started going down, I still hadn't made it to the campsite. I checked my map, I was close, maybe half a mile. That's when I found the second carcass. Another deer. This one was fresh, and it was hanging. Someone or something had strung it up by its back legs. The rope looked rough, almost like vine or something natural. The body swayed gently in the breeze, blood dripping into the dirt. The smell hit me a second later, warm, coppery, overwhelming. I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't alone out here. I backed away slowly, my hand on the knife clipped to my belt. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of it loud in my ears. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I turned and started walking fast. It was almost dark now, and I needed to get to the campsite. I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following me. But the trail behind me was always empty. When I finally made it to the campsite, it was nearly pitch black. I set up my tent as fast as I could, barely bothering with a fire. My hands were shaking. I wasn't scared yet, not exactly, but something was wrong. I could feel it in my chest. I sat in the tent with my flashlight off, just listening. The woods were dead silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving through the brush just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart slamming in my chest. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer or a bear, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like a person. They walked a slow circle around my tent, one step at a time, the sound of boots crunching in the dirt. I sat frozen, gripping my knife so hard my hand ached. I waited for them to say something, to knock on the tent, to do anything. They just kept walking. One circle, then another, then another. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I wanted to call out. I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I sat there for a long time, afraid to move. My legs were cramping. My mouth was dry. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked outside, the woods were empty. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there. I packed up and left before the sun came up. I didn't care about the rest of the hike. I just wanted to get out. The whole way back, I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping, branches moving. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally made it back to my truck, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost cried. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. But as I started the engine, I noticed something in the dirt. Boot prints. They circled my truck. I drove away as fast as I could. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. It wasn't an animal. and I'm never going back. I've always been drawn to the woods. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's the quiet. Maybe it's the way the trees feel like walls, the way the world seems to fall away the deeper you go. Out there, no one knows where you are. No one's watching. It's just you and the earth. I thought that was a good thing. Last fall, I took a solo trip up to a state forest in northern Pennsylvania. I won't say the name of the place, not because I'm trying to be mysterious, but because I don't want anyone else going there. I should have known better than to camp that deep alone. I've done it 100 times, but something felt different that weekend. The air felt heavier. The woods felt quieter. I shrugged it off. I got there around noon on a Friday, parked my truck at the base of a fire road and hiked about 6 miles in. No marked trails, just old logging roads and game paths. I carried everything I needed: food, water, tent, knife, rifle. The basics. I was planning to stay until Sunday. The first day went fine. I found a good spot to camp near a small stream, set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and spent the evening just sitting there, listening to the water. But by the time the sun went down, the woods felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it. There was no single thing I could point to. It was just a feeling, like the forest was holding its breath, the way the shadows stretched too far, the way the trees felt too close. I've camped enough to know how your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone, so I ignored it. I sat by the fire until I got tired, then crawled into my tent. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I'd wake up to the sound of movement. Slow footsteps, twigs snapping, soft, deliberate. Not an animal. I've heard enough deer and coyotes to know the difference. This was something heavier, something on 2 legs. I sat up and listened. The fire was dying outside. The woods were dark. I waited, holding my breath. The footsteps circled my campsite once, then stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My headlamp cut through the dark, lighting up the trees. Nothing. I stayed awake for another hour before I finally let myself lie down again. By then, it was nearly dawn. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Animals can move weird. Maybe someone else was hiking out there, a hunter, a backpacker. It happens. I packed a day bag and hiked farther into the woods, looking for high ground. By noon, I was miles from camp, standing on a ridge that overlooked nothing but trees for miles. No roads, no houses, just endless forest. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the tree line, about 100 yards down the ridge, just barely visible between the trunks. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, facing me. Long hair, pale skin, dark clothes. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the outline of her body, thin and motionless. My chest tightened. My first thought was, what the hell is she doing out here? There were no trails nearby, no campsites, no reason for anyone to be this deep in the woods. I raised my hand, not to wave, just to see if she'd react. She didn't. She just stood there, completely still. I watched her for another minute before I decided to head back. Something about her made my skin crawl. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to camp, the first thing I noticed was the firewood. I had left a small pile next to my tent. Now it was stacked differently, arranged neatly in a pyramid shape. I never did that. My stomach dropped. I checked my gear. My bag was still there. My tent was unzipped, but nothing was missing. Someone had been there. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed close to camp, rifle within reach, constantly checking the trees. Every time the wind moved the branches, I flinched. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I built a fire, but I didn't feel safe. I kept thinking about the woman, the way she stood so still, the way she didn't react. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, slow, heavy, coming from the trees behind my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle and waited, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the firelight. I could hear breathing, slow and shallow. I called out. No response. Then she stepped into the light. She looked different up close. Pale skin stretched tight over her face. Her clothes were dark, but dirty, like she'd been out there a long time. Her hair hung in tangled clumps, and she was smiling. Not a warm smile, not a friendly one. It was the kind of smile you get when someone knows something you don't. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. She didn't move, didn't blink. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. My finger hovered over the trigger. I wanted to say something, but my throat felt closed. And then she turned around, walked back into the woods, slow, calm, like she had all the time in the world. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes. I didn't care about the time or the dark. I threw everything into my pack and started hiking back toward the truck. I kept the flashlight low, rifle in my hands, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The whole way back, I kept hearing her. Footsteps in the trees, just out of sight. I never saw her again, but she followed me all the way back to the trailhead. Every time I stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too. When I finally made it to my truck, the sun was starting to come up. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, trying to calm down. When I finally looked up, she was standing at the edge of the woods, smiling. I never went back, and I never camp alone anymore. I wasn't supposed to be out there that long. Just a day hike, that's all it was supposed to be. I had no plans to camp, no intention of going deep enough where things could get dangerous. But that's the thing about the woods. One wrong turn, one bad decision, and it doesn't matter how experienced you are. Nature doesn't care. I parked my truck at the trailhead a little before 9 in the morning. It was early fall, the kind of day where the sun is warm, but the air still has a bite. The trail was a familiar one, an 8-mile loop that cut through dense forest, winding up to a rocky overlook before curving back toward the parking lot. I'd hiked it a dozen times before, but that morning I decided to try something different. About 2 miles in, I found an unmarked path branching off the main trail. It was narrow, barely more than a deer track, but it looked well worn enough that I figured other people had used it. I had plenty of time before dark, and I was feeling good, curious. I should have kept walking. The first hour on the new trail felt like every other hike. The woods were quiet, peaceful. Just the rustle of leaves under my boots and the distant sound of birds overhead. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in. The path got narrower. The ground was soft with moss. It didn't feel like a place many people had been. After another mile or so, I noticed something strange. The woods were silent. Not just quiet, completely silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing. I stopped for a second, listening. My chest felt tight, but I told myself it was nothing. Sometimes the forest gets quiet. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a bear or a coyote. I kept walking. Another mile in, I found the first marker. It was a wooden stake driven into the ground, painted red at the top. No numbers, no symbols. Just a red-tipped stake standing upright in the dirt. I crouched down to look at it. It didn't look old, but it didn't look fresh either. The wood was rough, weathered by rain. I glanced around. There was no reason for it to be there, no logging, no survey tape. Just this stake in the middle of nowhere. I thought about turning back, but I didn't. I don't know why. I kept walking. About 15 minutes later, I found the second one. Same kind of stake, same red tip. This time, there were 2 of them, side by side, driven deep into the earth. That was when I started to feel it. The uneasy weight in my chest, the sense that something was wrong. I checked my phone, but I had no signal. Nothing unusual about that this far out, but it still made my stomach sink a little. I kept moving faster this time. The trees got thicker. The light barely made it through the canopy, and the air felt colder. The trail that had been so clear before was harder to follow now, more overgrown. I had to push through branches, stepping over fallen logs, and that's when I smelled it. Rot. It hit me all at once, thick, heavy, choking. The kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, trying not to gag, and kept walking. I found the source about 50 yards later. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The body was collapsed in the middle of the trail, its legs bent at unnatural angles. The torso was torn open, ribs exposed, but there was something strange about it. No bite marks, no claw marks, just torn flesh, as if something had ripped it apart with its hands. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was a poacher or some sick person messing around in the woods. Either way, I didn't want to stick around. I turned to head back the way I came. The trail was gone. I don't mean I lost it. I mean it was gone. The path I had been following for miles was no longer there. Just trees. Thick, dark trees packed tight together. My stomach dropped. I scanned the forest, trying to calm myself down. Trails don't just disappear. Maybe I had walked past it. Maybe I was panicking. I retraced my steps, or what I thought were my steps, but I kept ending up back at the deer. That's when I noticed something worse. The red stakes were closer. There were 3 of them now, arranged in a tight triangle around the carcass. They hadn't been there before. My hands started shaking. I checked my watch. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. Sunset wasn't far off, and I was miles from my truck. I tried to calm down, but my breath was coming fast, shallow. I forced myself to pick a direction and start walking. Even if I wasn't on the trail, I knew the general way back. If I kept moving west, I'd hit a road eventually. But the farther I walked, the more the woods seemed to close in. The trees felt wrong, too close, too thick. My compass spun uselessly. No matter which way I walked, the light kept fading faster than it should have. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, with weathered wood and a slanted roof. No windows, just a single door slightly ajar. I should have walked away. I knew better, but at that moment, I wanted to believe someone was inside, someone who could help. I stepped up to the door and pushed it open. The inside was empty, no furniture, no tools, just dirt floors and old, dark stains on the wood. And in the center, another red stake. This one was taller, almost 4 feet high, with something hanging from it. A shirt, my shirt, the one I was wearing that morning. My blood ran cold. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear. I grabbed the stake, yanked the shirt off it, and backed out of the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They circled the cabin, looping over and over again. Bare feet, small, like someone had been walking around it for hours. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. Branches whipped at my face, my legs burning, breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred together. I stumbled more than once, but kept pushing forward. When I finally broke through the tree line, I almost cried. My truck was sitting right where I left it, the parking lot empty. I threw my pack in the back and peeled out, not looking back. The next day, I drove to the ranger station to report it. I told them about the stakes, the deer, the cabin. They just looked at me. "There's no cabin out there," they said. "There never has been. I don't know what I saw, but I'm never going back." I didn't plan to be out there for more than a couple of hours. I had time to kill that Sunday morning, and the woods seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. There's something about being out there alone, just trees, dirt, and sky, that makes the rest of the world feel distant. You can't hear cars. You can't hear people. You're surrounded by something older, quieter. I parked my truck at the trailhead a little before noon. I wasn't on a marked path. This was state forest land, the kind where you can wander for miles without seeing another person. I'd hunted the area a few times before, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had my GPS, a compass, a map, everything you're supposed to carry. It was one of those cold, gray days where the sky feels low, the kind of day where the light never really changes, just an endless dull haze. The trees were mostly pines, tall and close together, with dry brown needles carpeting the ground. No wind, no birds, just quiet. I hiked for about an hour, cutting across ridges and through narrow valleys, following game trails when I could find them. I wasn't going anywhere specific. I just wanted to walk. It wasn't until I noticed the first sign that I realized how far I'd gone. It was a posted notice nailed to a tree. Old, with the edges curling, but still readable. I frowned. I wasn't anywhere near the boundary lines marked on my map. This land was supposed to be public. I checked my GPS, no signal. I checked my compass. It spun lazily, like something was throwing it off. That didn't make sense. I decided to keep going. I figured I'd come out on a road eventually. I hadn't seen a single building or fence, so I wasn't too worried. Worst case, I'd turn around and follow my own tracks back. Another 20 minutes passed before I found the cabin. It wasn't much, just a one-room shack with a tin roof and peeling wood siding. No windows, just a door slightly cracked open. It looked abandoned, the kind of place a hunter might use once a year. But there was something about it that made me stop. Maybe it was the way it felt so out of place. No tire tracks, no trails, nothing that suggested anyone had been there in a long time. And yet, there it was. I walked closer, my boots crunching softly on the dry needles. The smell hit me before I reached the porch. Something sharp and metallic, like rust and old blood. I stepped back. There was a gut feeling I couldn't shake, a heavy weight in my chest telling me not to go any closer. I've learned to trust that feeling. I took a couple of pictures on my phone and turned to head back. That's when I saw the footprints. They were mine, but they weren't. I followed the trail I thought I had made, but instead of one set of prints, there were two. Side by side. One set matched my boots perfectly. The other set didn't. They were barefoot. I crouched down to look closer. The tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the pine needles. Small, narrow, human. They walked right alongside mine, same direction, same stride. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. I hadn't seen anyone out here all day, and these tracks weren't old. I kept moving. I tried to stay calm, but my breathing was shallow. I checked my GPS again. Still nothing. I pulled out my compass, spun once, then settled in the wrong direction. No matter which way I turned, it pointed west. That didn't make any sense. I picked up the pace, heading back the way I came. Or at least, I thought I was heading back. The trees all looked the same, the sky still that same dull gray. I started jogging, then running. My breath came in short bursts, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like an hour, I stopped, bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. And that's when I saw it. The cabin. The same cabin I had just left. My stomach dropped. I felt a cold, hollow ache in my chest. I hadn't turned around. I knew I hadn't. But there it was, same tin roof, same peeling wood. And this time, the door was wide open. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and keep moving. But something pulled me forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, stupidity. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking on the warped wood. The smell was stronger now, thick and metallic. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, breathing through my mouth. Inside, the room was empty. Just dirt floors, a broken chair, and something dark smeared across the walls. Blood, old blood. It wasn't just smeared. It was written. Not words, just lines. Dozens of long, thin lines drawn over and over again. Vertical, precise, like someone had been counting something. My head spun. I backed away, shaking. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to see this. I turned and ran. This time, I didn't stop. I sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at my arms and face. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. Eventually, I found a trail, a real trail, wide with fresh boot prints in the dirt. I followed it until I could see the parking lot through the trees. When I reached my truck, I finally let myself breathe. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there, heart pounding. I pulled out my phone to check the photos I had taken, but they were gone. No cabin, no footprints, just pictures of trees. I still don't know what I found out there. I never reported it. I never told anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about it. And in the dreams, the door is always open. I've always liked being alone in the woods. It's not about the quiet. It's the space, the distance, the feeling that, for a few hours, the rest of the world doesn't matter. No emails, no texts, no noise. Just trees, sky, and the sound of my boots on the dirt. That's why I decided to go for a hike last October. I was stressed, burnt out, and I just needed to get away for a while. I picked a trail I'd never done before. Something longer, deeper into the woods. 20 miles round trip. In and out. Easy enough. Or at least that's what I thought. I left my truck at the trailhead around 8 a.m. The sun was barely up, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. I had a pack with water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. Nothing heavy. I wasn't planning on staying out after dark. The trail started wide and well-worn, cutting through a thick forest of pines and oaks. The trees were close together, branches arching overhead. Dry leaves crunched under my boots with every step. For the first few hours, I was making good time. I passed a few other hikers in the morning, but by noon, I was alone. The woods were quiet, not in a creepy way, not at first, just calm. No wind, no birds, nothing but the sound of my footsteps. I stopped for lunch around mile 9, sitting on a fallen log to eat a protein bar and check my map. That's when I noticed something weird. The trail ahead of me wasn't on the map. It wasn't like I'd gotten lost. The trail was there, clear as day, dirt path, marked trees, the whole thing. But when I looked down at my map, it just wasn't there. I figured the map was old. Maybe they'd rerouted the trail since it was printed. No big deal. I had my compass and I knew the general direction I needed to go. I kept walking. The deeper I went, the weirder it got. The trail started to narrow and the trees pressed closer on both sides. The ground was soft with moss and the air smelled damp, like it had rained recently, but the dirt was dry. About half a mile later, I noticed the first marker. It was a small wooden post stuck in the ground, painted red at the top. No numbers, no symbols, just a red-tipped stake. I stopped and looked at it for a minute, but there wasn't anything special about it. I figured it was for hunting or something. I kept walking. Then I found the second one, and the third. Each one was about 100 yards apart, standing upright in the dirt. The farther I went, the more there were, 10, 20, maybe more, all identical. That's when the feeling started. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like awareness, that heavy, prickly sensation you get when you realize someone's watching you. My chest felt tight. I stopped and listened. Nothing. The woods were dead silent, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing. I'd read about stuff like that, how your brain can mess with you when you're alone in the woods. I kept moving. The trail kept getting narrower. The trees were so close now that I had to turn sideways to squeeze between them in some spots. The red markers were everywhere. Some of them were broken, lying flat in the dirt. Others were sticking out at weird angles. I checked my phone, no signal. That's when I started thinking about turning back. I looked at my watch. It was later than I thought, almost 3 p.m. I should have been heading back already. I turned around and started retracing my steps. Or at least I thought I did. After 10 minutes of walking, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. The trees were different, younger, thinner. The markers were gone. I pulled out my compass. It spun lazily, the needle drifting in slow circles. That didn't make any sense. Compasses don't just stop working. I kept walking. After another mile, I found something worse. A campsite, or what was left of one. There was a tent collapsed on its side, faded and torn. A camp chair lying on its back. An old metal cooler, lid open, with moldy food still inside. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, or they didn't leave at all. I called out. My voice echoed through the trees. No answer. I checked the tent. Empty. Sleeping bag still zipped up. A jacket crumpled in the corner. I found a wallet in one of the pockets. No cash, just a driver's license. The name and face didn't mean anything to me. I felt sick. I packed up my gear and kept moving, faster now. My heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, an old campsite someone had left behind. But I knew that wasn't true. Nobody leaves their wallet behind. The light was fading. The gray sky was getting darker, the shadows longer. I checked my phone again, still no signal. My watch said it was 5 p.m., but the sun was already low. I kept moving. By 6 p.m., it was almost completely dark. I had my flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the trees. The woods felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick. Every time I stopped, I thought I could hear something moving in the distance. I kept walking. I walked for hours. Felt like I was going in circles. The trees all looked the same. The ground was soft with pine needles. No trail in sight. At some point, I started seeing the red markers again. They were different this time. Bigger, closer. Some of them had been driven deep into the trees, splitting the bark. Others were broken in half, lying in the dirt. I found one still standing. It was taller than the others, almost 6 feet. Something was tied to the top of it. A boot. My boot. The same kind I was wearing. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. I tripped over roots, stumbled through bushes, scraped my hands on rocks, and then I saw headlights. I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road. A truck slowed down, the driver leaning out to ask if I was okay. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and kept walking. When I got back to my own truck, I checked the time. 2 a.m. I had been walking for 14 hours. I still don't know what happened out there, and I'm not going back to find out.